By morning, half the town's boats were gone, splintered, sunk, everything these families owned, torn apart in one night. And already, people were whispering a name, the wrong one. Everyone believed the harbor master. Why wouldn't they? He'd run this port for 20 years, but Nora had one photo, and it didn't match a single word he was saying. The whole town had already made up its mind. Guilty, case closed. So when one outsider stood up to speak, nobody expected proof, least of all the one person praying she'd stay quiet. He was just a kid on a fishing crew, 19, and scared. He leaned in, glancing over his shoulder, and whispered 4 words she never forgot. "You have to stop." She'd taken hundreds of photos that week, just background. Just the harbor at sunrise, until she looked closer at one of them and saw the thing everyone else had missed. "You all want to know who really did this." The room went silent. Nora lifted the photo into the air, and what everyone saw next changed everything. It happened in the middle of the night. A storm rolled in off the water, and by the time it passed, half the harbor's boats were wrecked, splintered, sinking. Nora stood on that pier in the rain, watching a whole town's livelihood tear apart. She'd only come here to take a few photos. Now she was standing in the middle of a disaster. And the worst part hadn't even started yet. But let's go back a week, to the morning it all began. Nora stepped off a bus into salt air and gray light, a college student with a camera and a simple plan. Document a fishing town before it faded away for good. Weathered boats, old men mending nets. She'd spent summers in a place just like this as a kid. Honestly, it felt like coming home. She had no idea what was coming. That's where she met him. An old fisherman, 63, hands rough as worn rope, mending a net on the dock. And something about him just stopped her. He reminded her of someone. Her grandfather, maybe. Same quiet patience, same crinkle around the eyes. They talked for an hour. Tides, weather, the way the town used to be. She didn't know it yet, but this gentle man was about to lose everything. And she'd be the only one beside him. The old man had a daughter, Marisol, 24, running the fish stall down at the market. Sharp, funny, fiercely protective of this town and everyone in it. She and Nora clicked right away. Over the next few days, Nora slipped into the rhythm of the place. Early mornings, strong coffee, the slow, easy talk of people who'd known each other forever. It felt safe, settled, the kind of calm that never lasts long in a story like this one. Then the weather turned. A big storm was coming in off the water, and the whole harbor scrambled to tie down the boats. That's when Nora first saw the harbor master up close. A big man, cold eyes, in charge of everything on that dock. He and the old fisherman had words. Something about the moorings, the safety lines. Nothing dramatic, just a flicker of tension in the wind. But Nora caught it, and later, she'd wish she'd watched more closely. The storm came in hard that night. Nora had never seen anything like it. The wind screamed. The water turned black and violent. And down at the harbor, the boats, the whole town's living, were slamming into each other in the dark. She ran down to help, but there was nothing anyone could do. Just stand there, soaked, watching it all come apart. By dawn, half the fleet was gone, and that was only the beginning. Morning brought the full picture, and it was worse than anyone feared. Boats that families had owned for generations, gone. Nets, gear, years of work, all of it splintered on the rocks. Marisol just stood there, staring, not saying a word. This town didn't have insurance for something like this. For most of them, those boats were everything. Nora watched the crowd gather on the dock. Quiet at first, then not so quiet. People wanted answers, and that's when the harbor master spoke up. Loud, in front of everyone. He said the old fisherman had been on watch that night. Said he'd left the safety lines loose, maybe on purpose, for an insurance payout. It was an ugly thing to say. But the town was scared and angry. And scared, angry people don't ask for proof. Nora watched their faces change. One by one, they turned on the gentle old man she'd shared coffee with just days before. Marisol wasn't having it. She stepped right in front of her father and told the whole crowd exactly what she thought of them. 30 years he'd fished these waters. 30 years he'd helped every single person standing there. And this was how they repaid him? But nobody moved. Nobody spoke up for him. They just looked away. Nora felt something twist in her chest. She barely knew these people. But she knew what wrong looked like. And this was wrong. That evening, Nora couldn't let it go. Something about the whole thing didn't sit right. The harbor master had been so quick to point the finger. Too quick. Almost like he'd had the answer ready before anyone even asked the question. And the old man, she'd looked in his eyes when they accused him. That wasn't the face of someone hiding a crime. That was the face of someone who couldn't believe what was happening. So Nora started to wonder, what if everyone was wrong? That night, Nora couldn't sleep. So she did what she always did when her mind wouldn't stop. She pulled out her camera and started going through her photos. The ordinary ones. The hundreds of frames she'd shot at dawn the morning before the storm. Rope, rust. Boats sitting still on gray water. Nothing special. She almost closed the laptop. And then she stopped. There, in the corner of one frame, behind the old fisherman's boat, a figure, crouched down low near the mooring lines, doing something with the ropes. And parked just up the dock, a vehicle. One she didn't recognize. One that had no business being there at that hour. She zoomed in. Her heart started to pound. It wasn't clear. It was grainy, half in shadow. But it was there. Someone had been at those lines the morning before the storm. Someone who wasn't the old man. Someone who left before the sun came up. She sat back, staring at the screen. The whole town believed the old fisherman had loosened those ropes. But Nora had a photograph that said somebody else was down there first. The problem was, a blurry figure in a dark corner wasn't proof. Not yet. She was going to need a lot more. And she had a feeling somebody didn't want her looking. The next morning, Nora went where you always go in a small town when you want to know things. The cafe. Nell had owned the place for 40 years. She poured coffee, wiped tables, and, most importantly, she watched. Nothing happened in that harbor that Nell didn't see. Nora sat down and, careful not to say too much, started asking questions about the harbor master, about who really had something to gain from all this. And Nell, well, Nell got quiet in that way people do when they've been holding something in. She'd seen things, she said, over the last few months. Strangers coming into town, city folks, sharp suits, expensive cars. The kind you never saw around here. And they kept meeting with one person, the harbor master, down at the far end of the dock, where they thought nobody was looking. Nell leaned in. She'd heard a word or two, passing by with the coffee. Words like development, waterfront, how much all this land would be worth. if it weren't covered in old fishing boats and stubborn old men who wouldn't sell. Nora felt a chill run down her spine. Suddenly, it wasn't just a blurry figure in a photo anymore. Now there was a reason, a motive. Somebody wanted this harbor empty, and a storm was the perfect way to clear it out. Nell had mentioned one more thing. A boy. One of the young deckhands, 19 years old, who'd been acting strange ever since the storm. Wouldn't look anyone in the eye. Jumped every time someone said his name. Nell figured he knew something. And she was right. Nora found him down at the end of the dock, coiling rope like his life depended on it. His name was Kai. And the second she started asking about that night, his whole body went stiff. She kept it gentle. She wasn't accusing him of anything, she said. She just wanted to understand what really happened. For a moment, just a moment, he looked like he might tell her. His mouth opened. His eyes flicked toward the water, toward the harbor master's office in the distance. And then something in him slammed shut. "I can't," he said, barely a whisper. "You don't understand. You don't know what they'll do." And then he was gone. Just picked up his rope and walked off fast, leaving her standing there in the fading light. But Nora had heard enough. They, not he. They. This wasn't one man acting alone. And that scared kid wasn't guilty. He was trapped. Somebody had their hooks in him. The question was, how deep? And how far up did this thing really go? And then, just a few days after the storm, way too fast to be a coincidence, a notice went up on the dock. Official looking, stamped and signed. The town, it said, would be holding a meeting to vote on whether to sell the harbor to a development company. Given the damage, given the costs, given that rebuilding the fleet would take money nobody had. Nora read it twice, and her stomach dropped. This was it. This was the whole point. Break the fleet, scare the town, and then, right on cue, offer them a way out. Sell. Take the money. Walk away. It was so clean it made her sick. And there was more. Because the old fisherman was now the town's scapegoat. His family had no standing left. No voice. People crossed the street to avoid Marisol. Whispered when she walked by. The two of them stood in front of that notice while neighbors they'd known for years pretended not to see them. Marisol's hands were shaking. "They're going to take everything," she said. "The harbor, my father's name, all of it. And there's nothing I can do." But Nora was already thinking. There was a meeting coming, a vote, a deadline, which meant she had a clock now. And whatever she was going to do, she had to do it before that vote. By now, word had gotten around. The girl with the camera was asking questions. And it didn't take long for that to reach the one man who didn't want any questions asked at all. He found her on the pier. The harbor master. Walked right up, close, and looked down at her with those cold, flat eyes. He kept his voice friendly. That was the worst part. Real quiet, almost kind. He said he'd heard she was new in town, just passing through doing some little school project. And he hoped she was enjoying her stay. But she should be careful, he said, poking around in things she didn't understand, stirring people up when they were already hurting. That kind of thing could turn a whole town against an outsider real fast, make her feel very unwelcome, very alone. Then he leaned in a little closer. "Some things," he said softly, "are better left the way they are. You understand me?" And he smiled and walked away. Nora stood there on that windy pier, heart hammering, and realized her hands were cold. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't even raised his voice. But that was a threat, plain as day. And here's the thing about threats. People only make them when they've got something to hide. He just told her, without meaning to, that she was on exactly the right track. It took Nora a while to admit something was off. At first, it was just this feeling, the kind you can talk yourself out of. Somebody watching. She figured she was just worn out and reading into things. That happens when you barely sleep, right? You start seeing shadows everywhere. And then one evening she came back and knew for sure. Someone had been in her room while she was gone. The strange thing is, they didn't take anything. Her money was still sitting there in plain sight, untouched. What they'd done was go through her stuff. A drawer she always shut was hanging open. Somebody had been digging around in her bag. And it didn't take a genius to figure out what they were hunting for. That camera. The photo. The one thing she had that actually meant something. Good news is she'd gotten in the habit of keeping it on her. No real reason. She just hadn't liked the idea of leaving it behind. Turned out that saved her. Still, the point came through loud and clear. Somebody knew she'd been digging. They knew roughly what she was holding. And they decided to stop pretending otherwise. She'll admit it. For a minute there, she wanted to pack up and go home where none of this could touch her. But she kept seeing that old man's face. Alone on the dock. So she stayed. That night, Nora went to see Marisol. And she found her at the kitchen table, surrounded by paperwork, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Because she hadn't. It was all falling apart. The bank was calling about the boat loan. The town had stopped bringing them work. Her father barely spoke anymore. Just sat by the window, staring at a harbor he could no longer go out on. 30 years on the water. And now people looked at him like a criminal. It was breaking him. And it was breaking her to watch. "He didn't do this," Marisol whispered. "You know that, right? You believe me?" And Nora took her hand and told her the truth. She didn't just believe it. She could prove it. Or she was close anyway. She told her about the photo, the figure at the ropes, the strangers Nell had seen, the development company, the whole ugly picture coming together piece by piece. For the first time in days, something flickered in Marisol's eyes. Hope. Fragile and scared, but real. But Nora was careful. Because a photo of a shadow and a story from a cafe owner, that wasn't enough. Not to stop a town vote, not to clear a man's name. They needed someone who'd actually been there that night. Someone who'd seen it with their own eyes. They needed Kai. It took 2 more days to get Kai alone. Nora found him in the old boat shed, hiding, basically. And this time, she didn't ask questions. She just sat down across from him and told him everything she already knew. The photo, the strangers, the plan. And she watched the fight drain right out of him. Finally, he talked. He'd needed the money. His mom was sick, behind on everything, and the harbor master had offered him a job. Easy work, he'd said. Just go down to the docks that night before the storm and loosen a few lines on a few boats. Make it look natural. Kai swore he didn't understand what it was really for. He thought maybe it was some insurance thing between grown-ups. He didn't know the storm coming would turn it into a disaster. He didn't know an innocent man would take the blame. And now he was terrified. Because he wasn't just a witness anymore. He was part of it. If he spoke up, he'd be admitting what he'd done. He could lose everything. Nora looked at this scared 19-year-old kid, shaking in a cold shed, carrying a weight no kid should carry. And she told him the truth, gently. Staying quiet wouldn't protect him. It would just let a good man go down for something a bad man planned. "You didn't cause the storm, Kai," she said, "but you can still do the right thing now." There was one piece still missing. Nora could put the harbor master at the docks. She could put Kai at the ropes. But she couldn't yet connect it to the money, to the people who'd actually profit. And for that, she went back to the one person who saw everything. Nell. The cafe was closed when Nora knocked. Nell let her in anyway, locked the door behind her, and put on a pot of coffee. Then she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She'd been doing her own digging, it turned out. Nell had a nephew who worked over at the county office, and she'd asked him a favor. That paper had a name on it. The development company that had quietly filed paperwork to buy the harbor land. Filed it, Nora realized with a chill, 2 weeks before the storm. Before anyone could possibly have known the boats would be destroyed. Unless, of course, they already knew. And there was one more name on that paper. A silent partner in the company. The harbor masters. Right there, in black and white. Nora sat back and let out a slow breath. That was it. That was the whole thing. Motive, method, and money, all tied together with a bow. She had a photo, a witness, and a paper trail. And in 2 days, the whole town would be in one room for that vote. The night before the vote, Nora didn't even try to sleep. She just sat at that little desk and went through it all one more time. The photo was blown up big now, printed out, the figure at the ropes about as clear as she was ever going to get it. Then the papers Nell had dug up, with the company name circled and the harbor master's name sitting right there underneath. And Kai. She'd been on the phone with him for the better part of an hour before he finally caved and said okay. He'd stand up in front of everybody and say what really happened. You'd think that would have felt good. It didn't. Honestly, it just scared her half to death. Because she knew what kind of room she was walking into. A bunch of people who'd lost everything and already made up their minds about who did it. A man with real power who'd leaned on her once and would happily do it again. And a 19-year-old kid whose nerve might just evaporate the second all those eyes landed on him. Anything could go sideways. Kai might clam up. Nobody might listen. The harbor master could spin the whole thing and paint her as the liar. One outside college kid with a folder against a guy this town had trusted for 20 years. She looked at the photo one last time. Then she turned off the lamp. Tomorrow she'd find out if any of it was enough. The hall was packed by the time Nora got there. Every seat taken, people standing along the walls, that low buzz of a town waiting to make a decision it didn't really want to make. Up front, the harbor master stood next to a man in a suit nobody recognized. The buyer. They already had the papers out on the table. This whole thing was supposed to be a formality. Somebody called for the vote. And that's when Nora stood up. For a second, she couldn't even get a word out. Her legs were shaking under her, her mouth went dry, and every single face in that room turned to look at the outsider who dared to interrupt. She was nobody here. A college kid with a camera who'd shown up 3 weeks ago. She had no right to be speaking, and everybody's expression said exactly that. She almost sat back down. Almost. But then she found Marisol's face in the crowd, and the old man beside her, staring at his own hands, too ashamed to look up. And that was enough to get her voice working. She said she had something the town needed to see before anybody signed anything. She said the story they'd all been told about that night wasn't true, and she could prove it. People started muttering right away. Somebody told her to sit down. The harbor master gave this tight little laugh, like she was a kid who'd wandered in by mistake. But Nora didn't sit down. She opened her folder instead. And she asked them one simple thing. Just look. Look at what she'd found, and then vote however they wanted. If she was wrong, they'd lose 5 minutes. If she was right, well, that was a different story. She held up the photo. The big one, the enlarged print, and she walked it down the front row so people could actually see. It was a shot of the harbor at dawn. The morning before the storm. Nothing dramatic at first glance, just boats and gray water. That's what she'd thought too, the first 100 times she looked at it. But then she pointed to the corner, to the old fisherman's boat, and to the figure crouched down at the mooring lines beside it. The room went quiet in a way it hadn't been all night, because everybody in that hall knew the old man had been blamed for leaving those lines loose. That was the whole story. That was why they were about to sell their harbor out from under themselves. And here was a photograph, time-stamped, taken before the storm ever hit, showing somebody else down there messing with the ropes. Somebody who wasn't him. Nora kept talking, steady now. She pointed out the vehicle parked up the dock, the one that didn't belong to any fisherman in town. She explained when the photo was taken and how she hadn't even noticed it until days later, going back through her files. You could feel the room shifting. People who'd been ready to shout her down a minute ago were now squinting at that photo, whispering to each other, sitting up straighter. The harbor master wasn't laughing anymore. He stepped forward and said the picture proved nothing. Blurry. Could be anybody. Could be some kid. Could be nothing at all. And honestly, on its own, he had a point. A shadow in a photo wasn't proof. But Nora just nodded, because the photo was only the beginning. She had a lot more than a photo. The harbor master went to work on the crowd. And you had to give it to him, he was good. He turned it all around on Nora. Who was this girl anyway? Some student from the city, right? Showed up out of nowhere, doesn't know anybody, doesn't understand how things work around here. And now she's waving a blurry picture around, stirring up trouble, telling grieving people their neighbors are liars. He asked the room why they'd take the word of a stranger over a man who'd looked after this harbor for 20 years. It was smart, because it wasn't about the photo anymore. It was about trust. Him, the guy they all knew, against her, the girl they didn't. And it was working. Nora could see it on their faces. The doubt creeping back in. A few people nodded along with him. Somebody near the back said, maybe they should just get on with the vote. For a moment, it looked like she was going to lose the whole room. But Nora had expected this. She'd known he'd make it about her word against his. So she didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice or try to defend herself. She just waited for him to finish. And then she said something that changed the temperature in that room real fast. She said she understood why they'd trust him over her. She was a stranger. That was fair. So they shouldn't take her word for any of it. They should take the word of someone they'd known his whole life. Someone who'd been there that night. Someone standing in this very room. And every head in that hall started turning, looking for who she meant, including the harbor masters. And for the first time, he looked nervous. For a second, nobody moved. And Nora's heart just about stopped, because this was the part that could fall apart. If Kai lost his nerve now, The whole thing was over. Then, near the back, a chair scraped, and the kid stood up. He looked terrible. Pale, shaking, like he might be sick right there in front of everyone. He was 19 years old, and he was about to say the hardest thing he'd ever said, in a room full of people who'd known him since he was born. But he stood up. That's the thing. He stood up anyway. And in this small, cracking voice, he told them. He said the harbor master had come to him a couple weeks back, offered him money, real money, which he needed because his mom was sick and the bills were piling up. All he had to do was go down to the docks that night, before the weather turned, and loosen some of the lines. Make it look like a mistake. Kai swore he didn't know what it was really for. He thought it was some insurance thing. He never once imagined the storm would come in that hard, or that an innocent man would take the fall for it. He was crying by the end of it. Kept saying he was sorry, over and over, looking right at the old fisherman, saying he never meant for any of it to land on him. You could have heard a pin drop in that hall. And every person in that room was doing the same math now. A scared kid with no reason to lie, confessing to his own part in it. That wasn't a blurry photo anymore. That was a witness. The harbor master started backing toward the door, but it wasn't over yet. Because the harbor master could still argue that he'd never told the kid to do it. That it was Kai's word against his. And a man like that, cornered, will say anything. That's when Nell stood up. Sweet old Nell from the cafe, who everybody in that town had known for 40 years, who'd poured half of them their morning coffee since they were kids. Nobody was calling her a liar. Nobody was calling her an outsider. She had a paper in her hand, and she held it up so they could all see it. She said she'd done some checking of her own. Turned out a development company had filed paperwork to buy the harbor land. And here was the date they filed it, 2 full weeks before the storm. Before any boat was damaged, before there was any reason on earth to think this harbor would be for sale. She let that sink in a second. How does a company plan to buy something 2 weeks before the disaster that makes it available? Unless somebody already knew the disaster was coming. And then she read out the last part. The name of the silent partner in that company. The person set to make a fortune the moment this town voted to sell. It was the harbor master. The whole room turned on him at once. Not with the confusion from before, but with real anger now. The kind that comes when people realize they've been played. Played by the one man they'd trusted to look out for them. He made it about 2 steps toward the exit before a couple of the younger fishermen stepped in front of the door. There was nowhere left for him to go, and just like that, the whole room understood. You could watch it happen, face by face. The photo, the kid's confession, that paper with the date on it and the harbor master's name. Put it all together, and there was really only one way to read it. The storm hadn't ruined this town by accident. Somebody had helped it along. And it wasn't the old man they'd spent weeks blaming. It was the man they'd trusted to protect them. People turned around in their seats to look at the old fisherman. This man they'd whispered about, crossed the street to avoid, treated like a criminal in his own home. And he was just sitting there, quiet, with tears running down into that gray beard of his. Not angry, just tired. Relieved, maybe, after all those weeks of carrying something he didn't deserve. Marisol had her arm around him, holding on tight, and she was crying too. But it was a different kind of crying now. One by one, people started coming over. Old friends who'd turned their backs, neighbors who'd said cruel things. They came up to him with their heads down, not really knowing what to say. Because, what do you say? Sorry doesn't cover it. But they said it anyway. Some of them just put a hand on his shoulder. A few couldn't even look him in the eye. And the old man, being who he was, forgave them before they even finished apologizing. That was just how he was built. Nora stood off to the side and watched the whole thing, and honestly, she had to blink back a few tears herself. This was why she hadn't gotten on that bus. Right here. This. As for the harbor master, there was no talking his way out of this one. The vote to sell got thrown out on the spot. And once the town started really digging, the rest fell apart fast. The paper Nell found was just the start. Meetings people suddenly remembered. Money that didn't add up. The real authorities got involved, the ones from outside who didn't owe him anything. Kai told them everything, on the record this time. And the man who'd run that harbor for 20 years, who'd pointed the finger at an innocent old fisherman, was finished. That suit from the development company? Gone the second the deal collapsed. Nora watched them lead him out, and she didn't feel triumphant. Mostly she just kept thinking how close it had been. A few more days and he'd have gotten away with all of it. The one everybody worried about was Kai. He'd done a real wrong thing, even if he hadn't understood what it was for. And some people wanted him punished, right alongside the harbor master. But the old fisherman stepped in. He reminded them the kid was 19. That his mom was sick and a grown man with power had used all that against him. Was Kai wrong? Sure. But he was also the one who stood up in that hall and told the truth when staying quiet would have been easier. He's the reason I got my name back, the old man said. I'm not letting this town break him for it. And that was that. When the man you wronged is the first one defending you, it's hard for anybody else to keep throwing stones. Kai would help repair the damage the honest way. But he wasn't losing his life over one bad decision. With the sale dead and the truth out, the town finally turned to what actually mattered. Fixing what the storm had broken. And here's the thing about a place like this. When they pull together, they really pull together. The insurance that was supposed to be impossible turned out it wasn't, once there was proof the damage was deliberate. Money came in. Even neighboring harbors sent boats and hands to help. Nora ended up staying longer than she'd planned. Her little school project turned into something else entirely. Sleeves rolled up, hauling lumber, learning more about boat repair than she ever expected. The old fisherman got his boat on the water first. The whole town made sure of it. And the morning it went out again, half of them stood on the dock and cheered. Marisol pulled Nora into a fierce hug that said everything words couldn't. Eventually, it was time to go. School was waiting. Her real life, the one she'd stepped away from 3 weeks and a whole world ago. She packed her bag, slung the camera over her shoulder, and walked down to the dock one last time. The sun was setting, painting the whole harbor gold, the boats rocking gentle on the water like nothing bad had ever happened here. Hard to believe, looking at it now, how close this place came to being paved over and forgotten. She'd come here for a photo project. Something about a fading way of life. Somewhere along the way, it became the most important thing she'd ever done. Funny how that works. You show up looking for one thing, and life hands you something else completely. She thought about the old man, back on the water where he belonged. Marisol, who'd become a real friend. Kai, getting a second chance he'd actually earned. A whole town still standing because one person wouldn't look away from something that didn't sit right. And that was the part that stuck with her. She wasn't anybody special. No badge, no power, no connections. Just a college kid with a camera who paid attention. And it turned out that was enough. Sometimes that's all it takes. She raised her hand, waved once, and headed off toward whatever came next.